positive feedback. So not just a few words about you, you know, just the way you wanted it. That Willow was an English language fellow through the US Department of State English language programs, and right now, for a while, she is not. But there is a chance of you becoming a fellow in future. And let me quote what you said to me that made me really happy and inspired. I was asked by the consulate to return for another year as a fellow, and I'm waiting to hear details. Yes, but as far as I know, I will resume my fellowship in Poland for the 2021, possibly virtually. So this is great news. Yes, and I'm sure that I won't be the only one to keep my fingers crossed for it. Now, just a few words. You graduated from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. You have the whole variety of professional interests and activities, like in teaching English as a second language, teaching English as a foreign language, in adult education, in community college, university context. And this is the most impressive part, because this tells me that you are a very knowledgeable person in terms of intercultural communication, and maybe in future you could prepare a webinar for us about intercultural differences, because you not only know the American culture, but you also know Japanese culture and South Korean culture. So this is a very unique kind of knowledge. You are on LinkedIn, yes. So I have already linked with you on LinkedIn, so that is great, a great thing, because I can follow what you are interested in. And today, Willow will be telling us about media literacy, and this is a very important topic. When I teach ICT to my students, they sometimes are surprised that I teach them, me, digital immigrant, telling them about them who are digital natives, about ICT. But the most that we can give to our students is the ability to identify bias and misinformation. And this is what you wrote in the summary of your webinar, so that students are aware of what is happening around them, how they are manipulated by the way they receive information. And so you will offer now to us short critical thinking activities that can be incorporated into writing and vocabulary lessons. I can't wait to hear that. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Luciana, for that introduction. And I think that Marcin wanted to say a few things about IATEFL Poland before we started. So I wanted to give him...
So I'm excluding myself. Now, Marcin, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. I just want to remind you that today we meet Willow, but there's a chance that we meet all together at IATEFL Poland online meetup. It will be an online event, an online conference on 18th, 19th September 2020. And that's the chance for you to get connected to global community of teachers. And we hold the biggest event for teachers of English in Europe, apart from UK. So please come to iatefl.org.pl and take a look at our conference, and also subscribe to our channel on YouTube, where you can find the past webinars. Thank you very much, Lucyna. Thank you very much, Willow. And that's the time for media literacy. Thank you very much, Willow.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Martin. Okay, so today we're going to talk about media literacy and identifying the language of bias. And as Luciana said, I was the English language fellow in Poland this previous year. I had planned to stay there until July, but COVID-19 caused the US government to suspend all the fellowships. So right now I'm waiting to hear if I will be returning to Poland or working virtually, but I'm looking forward to that. And let's see, so let's get started. As I said, my name is Willow Barnosky, and I was a fellow at the University of Adjectives in Poland. And right now I am back in California, in San Jose, California, and so I have a photo here of some California poppies for you to see. Okay, so today in this webinar, I will define media literacy, and I will suggest how to incorporate media literacy into language classes specifically, and describe a few ways in which language can be used to signal bias. So there are so many things that you can talk about when it comes to media literacy, but I'm going to focus on language and bias. And I'll share some activity ideas to raise student awareness of language use and bias. And after this webinar, it's my hope that you'll be able to use or adapt the media literacy activities and resources for your specific teaching context. And also, throughout the webinar, you can post questions or comments in the chat. I'll ask you some questions to answer. And then if you have any other questions at the end of the webinar, there'll be time for you to ask them, and we can talk a little bit about those. So first of all, what is media literacy? And this is a definition from in medialit.org in Canada. And it says that media literacy is concerned with helping students develop an informed and critical understanding of the nature of mass media, the techniques used by them, and the impact of these techniques. So that's just one definition of media literacy. So to get started, I wanted to ask you, I guess we can't really do partner questions now because you're not able to talk to a partner, but for those of you who are in the chat box in this seminar, can you share with us, why do you think it's important for students to develop media literacy, your students in particular, in your particular context? And have you incorporated media literacy into your classes, and if so, how? So if you could just type something in the chat box to say why you think it's important, and if you have done anything with media literacy in your classes. And I see that a few people are typing. Okay, so for critical thinking, because it's crucial in the modern world, absolutely. For evaluation, to recognize hoaxes, definitely. And yes, definitely to differentiate between fake and authentic news. That's quite a task, right? To be more connected around the world and the demand of the modern world, to use media better. And someone said that people are easily ruled without media literacy. Absolutely. To develop media literacy in reading comprehension and speaking activities. That's great. And for those of you who have done media literacy activities, if you'd like to share any links or any activities you've done in the chat throughout the webinar, that would be fantastic. It's important to think independently. Students aren't aware of manipulation techniques. Fantastic. Encourage students to differentiate, yes, between fact and opinion, and draw their own conclusions. Absolutely. So I'll wait one more minute for some more responses, and then we'll continue. To judge what they read or hear, yes, absolutely. Someone did the media literacy MOOC. That's great. I'll be sharing that resource too. Using language well. First News is a weekly newspaper. Great. And important to express one's own opinions. Wonderful. Okay. Fantastic. So it sounds like some of you have already been doing media literacy activities, and that is wonderful. And I hope that you'll share some links and ideas that you have, because anyone who's done media literacy is, in a way, their own expert, and I hope that we can share resources with each other. Okay. So, and to talk a little bit more about media, because some people tend to think of media as traditional media, like the TV, radio, newspapers, and magazines, but of course also our students are dealing with text messages, memes, viral videos, social media, video games, and advertising, etc. So our students today have a lot more to learn when it comes to media literacy, in the sense that media is so much larger than it used to be, right? And all media was created for a reason, and understanding that reason is the basis of media literacy. So that kind of incorporates a lot of what you've already said, that we want students to understand the reason behind media literacy so that they're not manipulated, and so that they can understand what they're seeing. And this information comes from commonsensemedia.org, which has a lot of resources for both parents and teachers. And other reasons for media literacy is that it helps students learn to think critically. They become smart consumers of products and information. They can recognize point of view or bias, right? And they can understand the author's goal, which really helps when we're teaching students to do academic writing, when they have to think a lot about what's the goal of this writing. Is it to persuade? Is it just informative, etc.? And because all of us are media creators now, we can help students to create their own media responsibly. So I wanted to recommend this book called Post-Truth by Lee McIntyre. It's through MIT Press. If anyone's interested in reading different books about fake news, media literacy, I found this really interesting, and I made this little graphic about it because in this book he talks about the case of U.S. tobacco companies and what they did in order to kind of hide the facts of how dangerous cigarettes were for people and are for people. So he talks a lot about this idea of some companies engaging in science denial. So I created this graphic that says blueprint for science denial. And so one of the first things that the tobacco companies did when the studies started coming out showing how dangerous cigarette smoking was is that they founded their own experts. So they paid people to do their own research and studies. And then that led to number two, which was then suggesting that there are two sides to the story. You know, some scientists say and some researchers say cigarette smoking is bad for your health, and some say that it's not. So then they used the power that they had to push their story with public relations and governmental lobbying. And number four, which I think is really important to focus on, is this capitalizing on public confusion. So, you know, you had this idea that what's the truth? Some people say this, some people say that. And I think that's really important with media literacy, is that there's so much information out there, and people often, there's a tendency to throw up your hands and say, well, how do we even know what's true? But that's done intentionally, right? And then the final step is to dispute the scientific results that don't favor you. So if you're interested in this pattern of science denial, and this book says that it came from, well, in recent years, it came from the tobacco companies. It's really fascinating to see that process and how that is used in different ways. Okay, so leading on, or following up from that, the fact that media literacy is a process and an exchange of ideas. So, and there's not always one right answer, but sometimes there is. So for us as educators and for our students, it might be really frustrating sometimes to think, well, what's the right answer? Just tell me one site I can always go to and one resource that always has the truth, or that's always reputable, and I'll use that. And it's because it's so difficult to wade through all the information. But unfortunately, media literacy is not that easy, and it's a process. And even reputable sources sometimes might give different information. People might be confused. So it's about encouraging our students to exchange ideas, to talk about this, to analyze, to criticize, and to feel comfortable having those discussions. Because there's not always one right answer, but sometimes there is. I'm not trying to say that there are always two sides to a story, because I think that also can lead to confusion. So media literacy is being aware that the information overload is also sometimes purposely designed to confuse consumers. So for students to think about to be aware of the fact that that confusion is something that is intentional and purposeful, and that we all have the responsibility as media consumers to do the work to find out what the truth is. If 4 or 5 reputable sources are saying one thing, and maybe 1 or 2 less reputable sources are saying something different, although there are 2 sides being expressed, we can make the reasonable judgment that probably the 4 reputable sources are giving us more helpful information, or more providing more authentic news or authentic information. Okay, so I was thinking about the fact that although we all want to teach media literacy, many of us don't teach a dedicated media literacy class. So I wanted to ask if you can post in the chat box if any of you are teaching a dedicated media literacy class. So your class is 100% media literacy. You have the time and you're expected to just teach media literacy in that class. And I wanted to see, is anyone teaching 100% media literacy? Okay, I'm seeing mostly no's, no such chance, no. Yes, and that's what I expected, because I think that's normal. I've never taught a media literacy class. Oh, and someone did say yes, so interesting. And actually, any of you who have taught a media literacy class, please, any resources you have or a way that you approach teaching that class, please share that in the chat so that we can learn from that. Because in my experience, I've never met someone who's been fortunate enough to have that. So this webinar was designed for people who haven't been able to teach an entire class on media literacy, especially maybe those of us who taught in university might have more of a chance, but especially if you're teaching primary, secondary, that you might not have a dedicated class for that. So I designed this webinar to talk about things that we can do within classes that we're already teaching. So I was thinking about a lot of us teaching academic writing classes and how we can include activities that will encourage our students to be more aware of language and bias and become better media consumers. So when we teach academic writing, we're often really focusing on helping students learn to write in a more concise and precise way. So I have an example here from one of my previous classes that the prompt was that the mayor has proposed that the city offer free Polish language classes to international visitors, students, and residents. And students had to respond to this. And here are a few sentences taken from some of the essays. One is, this would be a really great way for newcomers to get to know local residents. Another one was, this proposal is very helpful for visitors and would make their new start in a new country much better. And Polish classes would be tremendously helpful for much better functioning in the city. So I'd like you to look at those 3 sentences and think about, if you're teaching an academic writing class and your students are writing these sentences, what could you say to your students? What kind of feedback could you give them about making these sentences, making their writing more concise and more precise? And especially if you're preparing students for some sort of standardized test or a test they need to take in which there are word limits. What could you say to the students? And what do you notice that's similar about those 3 sentences that you could work on with the students? So if you could just post something in the chat box with your responses. My presentation has disappeared, so I'm trying to find it again. Okay. Okay, so for those 3 sentences, what do you notice in terms of wanting your students to write more concisely and more precisely? What would you say to your students? So Marta says she can't see can you see the phrases now? Are you able to see the screen now with the phrases? Okay, great. So a few people are saying they can't see the phrases. So the first one is, this would be a really great way for newcomers to get to know local residents. So how could they make that more concise or precise? Okay. Okay, so people are talking about adjectives and adverbs. Really great, very helpful, tremendously, very not common in academic writing. First and third sentence is not on point. First one is too informal. Okay. Mhm. Okay. And so some of you are talking about opinions and being subjective, and you're ahead of me because for this slide, we're just talking about making things more concise and precise, but you're right. You're already talking about what we're going to get to in a little bit. So let me move on and give some examples. Or actually, let me show you what I was focusing on is in these sentences are something called intensifiers. Now that's not a proper grammatical category, but it's a descriptive word used to describe adverbs that are used to strengthen the meaning of other words or expressions and show emphasis. And many of you mentioned the adverbs. So adverbs that show emphasis. And here are some examples of intensifiers that we saw in those writings. And actually, let me say that my students, I took those examples from my students writing in Poland. My students in Poland were amazing writers. Their English was incredible. And so I had to work hard to kind of pull out some examples of how to point out some problems with precision and concision. Okay, so back to intensifiers. So some examples are, she was so upset, I felt extremely sorry for her. So as some of you pointed out, words like so, extremely. He has a very strict professor. He was much happier with his previous professor. Their behavior was really offensive. So words like so, extremely, very, much, really. And then some more examples: amazingly, fantastically, incredibly, insanely, remarkably, ridiculously, strikingly, terribly, terrifically, and usually. So depending on what students you're working with, your students might not have as much of a problem as this, but I've often found students who will use these words for emphasis, sometimes to increase a word count, and often these words don't have a lot of meaning in themselves, and but the fact is that they're just not very precise and concise, which is what we're aiming for in academic writing. And again, we're talking about academic writing. We're not talking about speech, right? Or informal writing, in which these would be perfectly appropriate. And intensifiers enhance and give additional emotional context to the word it modifies, as some of you pointed out. So whenever we see writing in which the writer is trying to cause some kind of emotional reaction, that's when we need to think about bias. Is this person is trying to cause a certain feeling as opposed to giving logical information, right? It's more subjective than objective. So one thing that you could do, that you could slip into class after you talk to students about intensifiers, if you're doing academic writing activities with them to make them more aware of intensifiers, is you could give them a few examples, authentic examples in which intensifiers are used. And then you could ask them, are these formal or informal examples of English? And is it appropriate or inappropriate to use intensifiers? Okay, and you could ask them to identify the intensifiers. So this is just about raising awareness, because it's so important to make students aware of different registers of the language and also make them more aware of language of bias. So the first one was from a review site, and it says, good food, ridiculously slow service, right? And I visited this place with 3 friends. I don't know if it's because we were there, but the service was ridiculously slow. So here's an example of an intensifier used. The service wasn't just slow, it was ridiculously slow. And of course, students could identify that as informal. And it could be appropriate because when you're reading a review, you want to know someone's opinion. And that's fine if they're sharing strong emotions because you want to make an opinion about where you'll spend your money. The second one was from a tweet, and someone's response to a statement they didn't agree with was to say, that is ridiculously simplistic and untrue. And so by using that intensifier, it makes the response stronger. Is it necessarily helpful, or is it precise? No. But again, this is Twitter, and it looks like this person doesn't have a blue check mark. It's not a politician or a public figure. They're free to post their opinion in this informal setting. And down below, I have a few examples from the news, and I think one is from Washington Post, and the other two might be from the New York Times. I have the source, but I can't see it. So these are some news sources. And the first quote says, "He has been consistently undazzling in the debates and in his policy rollouts." So consistently undazzling. The next one, "He has shown that he is completely, ridiculously incompetent," right? So completely, ridiculously. And the last one, "We are incredibly disappointed at this intentional action," he said, "a false plan." So incredibly disappointed. So you could talk to your students and ask them about, is this formal, informal, appropriate, inappropriate? So from the news, we would hope and expect that there'd be a higher level of objective language. But in the case of these are quotations taken from the news. So this is, in essence, this is speech, right? And speech is much more informal. So you could talk to students about this. And also for them to keep in mind when reading a news article or watching the news, that if something is a quotation, it might not be said in such an objective way, and there's a lot of subjectivity there. So just by making students aware of these words, asking them which are the intensifiers, and asking them too about the reason for the use of these intensifiers. Like in the first one, this person really doesn't want you to go to that restaurant. In the second one, the person wants to show how ridiculous, how wrong they think someone's opinion is, and they want to influence you too. And the last one, instead of just saying, he's been undazzling, he's incompetent, we're disappointed, they use these intensifiers to try to influence people to share their opinion, okay? So another activity that you can do in class too with your students, again, to raise awareness about intensifiers so that they can start hearing them. And we want our students to be hearing intensifiers and noticing them so that they know that that's a clue, that that's a signal of subjectivity and possibly bias, okay? And so for this one, for example, it says, write an advertisement for an object near you. Include at least 5 intensifiers in your ad. So this could be something you have your students work with a partner. Maybe they choose their phone, they choose a bag, they choose something that they have, and they have to write this advertisement, using all of these superlatives and these intensifiers, which is so common in advertising. And that will, make them more aware of the use of intensifiers. And this is something like, often as an instructor, we might have that 5 minutes in the beginning of class or 5 minutes at the end of class when maybe not everyone's there, or at the end of class when you finish your material earlier than you expected. This is a way you can slip in these activities, and this is media literacy. So even if you're not teaching a dedicated media literacy class, this is something that you're encouraging students to be intelligent consumers. Another way that you can use this is if you're doing peer reviewing when you're teaching academic writing, you can incorporate something else in the peer review sheets instead of just having students be looking at specific vocabulary or grammar. Specific grammar. You can have them be looking for certain vocabulary like intensifiers. So you could add this to your peer review sheet. So for example, are there intensifiers in this writing? And they can say yes or no. If yes, list them here. And here the students could say really, great way, tremendously helpful. And then do the intensifiers make the sentences sound? And then you could have a list maybe of things you want students to avoid, like imprecise, inconcise, vague, wordy, emotional, too subjective, etc. And then students can check the things that are caused by the use of intensifiers. And then having the students write a suggested correction below, because we don't want students to only be able to notice this use of subjective or biased language, we want them to be able to correct it. So instead of saying really great way, which someone in the chat box had pointed out is very informal, they could say convenient way or use another word. Instead of saying tremendously helpful, just say helpful, right? So this is another way that you can have students working on recognizing the language of bias. Okay, and so for next, we're going to talk a little bit about teaching vocabulary specifically. Of course, academic writing, vocabulary, it's all sort of mixed. So we're going to talk about extreme adjectives. So some extreme adjectives, for example, big would be a more base adjective versus huge, which is extreme, small versus tiny, which is extreme, and intelligent versus brilliant, which is extreme. And the use of extreme adjectives can signal intent to appeal to emotions, to convince or persuade, and it can be a signal of bias. So we might hear this often when politicians are talking. They're using lots of these extreme words to really try to encourage people to agree with them or to think a certain way. So here's a list of some adjectives that are more base or neutral adjectives. And I'd like you to, this is something you could do with your students, but I thought we could take a minute here to look at these words and think of what would be an extreme adjective for each of these adjectives. So for example, if the word is cold, an extreme adjective could be freezing. So if you can just spend a few minutes to think about this and write a few examples of extreme adjectives for this list of words. Okay, someone's saying filthy for dirty, yes. Clean or pure, spotless, great. Great. Angry, furious, crowded or packed, clean, pristine, great. Crowded, jam-packed, yes. Tired, exhausted, old, ancient, great. Scary or terrifying, petrifying, tired or weary, immaculate for clean, worn out for tired. Let's see. Drained for tired, Great. Pristine, packed, terrifying. I think it looks like you've covered all of them. There are multiple answers for each one, but great. Tired, knackered, yes. Horrific or scary, yeah, horrific, horrifying. Great. So this is something, again, to have to just raise students' awareness about degrees of adjectives, which can be quite difficult depending on the level of the students. And here I gave some of the example answers. I think you all came up with all of those. And a related topic is loaded language. And here I have a photo of loaded nachos, which is one of the things I missed when I was abroad, and probably one of the first meals I had when I came home. So loaded language is language that has a strong positive or negative connotation beyond the ordinary definition. And it often exists as a substitute that's negative or positive. So instead of using a neutral term or a term without a lot of emotional connotation, someone has chosen to use a term that brings with it all this baggage of maybe positive or negative meaning. And this can often influence an audience by appealing to emotion or stereotypes. There's also something related called like dog whistling, and it's when sometimes a word is used that carries a lot of baggage, and depending on the audience, they might be able to interpret all of that attached baggage to a word, whereas people outside of that intended audience might not even know what the other associations are. So these are definitely used to manipulate people. So for some examples of loaded language, you could give students some nouns, adjectives, whatever, and compare them and ask them if they can determine which of those words might be neutral, which of those words are positive, which are negative, And are they synonyms, or is there a certain connotation that comes with these words? So I'd like you to just spend a few minutes to look at these sets of words and tell me if you think that any of them are negative or positive, and or maybe the context that you'd hear them in. So first is cheap versus inexpensive. Second, group versus mob. Third is bureaucrat versus public servant. Next is challenging versus distressing. Remove versus eliminate. Historic versus memorable. And vigilante versus crime fighter. So within each of these pairs, like for example, is cheap a positive term or a negative term? And is inexpensive positive, negative, neutral? Like which, how would you explain to students the differences between these two terms? Yeah, someone said it depends on the text. It definitely depends on the text. It's definitely contextual, sure. Yeah, cheap can mean badly made. True, cheap often has that kind of negative connotation that it's low quality, right? Public servant, positive, okay. By giving them the context, sure. Okay, crime fighter is neutral or positive. So someone mentioned softening language, that inexpensive is softer and cheap is more direct. It's a good observation. Mm-hmm. Eliminate can have a sort of emotional shade to it, yes. Historic can be used to push specific agendas. Mm-hmm. Depends on what fence of the side of the fence you're sitting on. Yes. Okay. So I'll wait one more minute and then I'll talk a little bit about these and respond to what you said. And someone also pointed out the choice of word depends on your intention and the point you're trying to make, which is important because that's media literacy, right? So even just making students aware of that, right? It depends on the situation for sure. Mm-hmm. Okay, so and depends on the style of writing. That's true. That's true. So for the first one, cheap versus inexpensive, several of you mentioned cheap can have this connotation of something that's low quality. Inexpensive is more neutral. And someone pointed out that it could be you're using softening language maybe by saying inexpensive versus cheap. And that's true. And often if we're talking about academic language or formal language, there is that idea of kind of softening things to make things sound more objective, less potentially offensive or upsetting, trying to avoid emotional connotation. And the second one, group versus mob. Group is a neutral term. Mob usually has this connotation that it's a group of people that are doing harm, or that it's a group of people that are viewed as frightening. And then this is also a chance to talk to your students about discrimination and racism, and which kind of people would be described as a mob. Would a group of wealthy white people be described as a mob? Probably not. So talking to students about those issues too. Bureaucrat versus public servant. And this kind of, I mean, so much of what I'm talking about, I'm talking about from the perspective of someone who's from the United States, because that's the context I know the most. And in the States too, this would sort of be politically charged. You know, a bureaucrat is a negative sounding word to say that, you know, someone who works for the government is part of this bloated system. And public servant would be more from a liberal stance of saying that people that are working in the government are serving the public. I mean, that's definitely not black and white. It really, you know, it can vary, but those two terms have that connotation here. Challenging versus distressing. Challenging is a fairly neutral term. If something is challenging, it's a challenge. But if you're viewing something challenging as distressing, if you're describing it that way, it makes it seem quite extreme or really a negative experience, possibly. Remove versus eliminate. Remove, again, is more neutral. Eliminate has more of an emotional charge. It might even make you think about, you know, eliminating a person. So it might have this really, you know, strong and frightening connotation. And again, it depends on the context. And historic versus memorable. Someone mentioned that historic can be used to kind of push a certain agenda. And that's true. If something is described as historic, the meaning is that it's something that's nationally or internationally meaningful. So no, I wouldn't say, you know, graduating from college for me was a historic moment. That's a personal thing. I would say it's memorable, but historic because it has that connotation of something that should be meaningful to a large group of people. That is sort of pushing an agenda, right? Saying something is historic or something isn't historic, and it can also be a way of pushing an agenda. Vigilante versus crime fighter. Again, this would be something that I think has to do with the context of discrimination. Someone who's a vigilante, that's a negative term. Someone who's doing something illegal, something violent, someone working outside the law versus a crime fighter is a more positive term of someone who's defending the community, someone who's, you know, practically like a Batman figure, right? Great. And someone mentioned connotations, yes. Okay, so another thing that you could do with your students is either find authentic examples online or just, you know, come up with a few examples of your own and ask them to compare these sentences. So for example, the first one, a group of concerned citizens supported the mayor, versus 1B, an angry mob protested climate change. So, and you can even I would ask my students in the case of these two things, tell me what the writer's opinion is, right? So in 1A, what is the writer's opinion about people who support the mayor? And do you think the writer supports the mayor? And how, you know, without the writer having said, I support the mayor or the mayor is right, just by using that wording of concerned citizens sends a certain message, right? And the second one, an angry mob protested climate change. What is the writer's view of protesters? And, you know, in the United States, it might even be someone that doesn't believe in climate change. But just from reading this, you can clearly see that the person has a negative view of the protesters, right? And then 2A and 2B, Paul Anderson, a local crime fighter, acted in self-defense, versus 2B, vigilante John Sensnig attacked a local man. And I mean, you could tell students this could even be describing like the exact same actions, right? But Paul Anderson is seen as he's heroic, and John Sensnig, you know, just the words, not just the noun, vigilante versus crime fighter. Yeah, he is a hero. Sounds like a hero. But in the second one, you know, using the word attacked, which is quite negative, versus in the first one, the hero is acting in self-defense. So how strongly these can convey a certain position. And for students to think about, if they're hearing the same message again and again and again, what they're sort of taking in and believing without even being aware of it. Yeah, and someone pointed out too, saying local man, you know, makes it sound like, you know, a local citizen, a beloved father, a beloved neighbor was attacked by this vigilante, right? So that also adds some connotation there. Another thing that you can do with your students too is, especially if you're working with students who you think might not always know the different connotations of these words. You know, I've been studying Spanish for 20 plus years, and there's still times that I use a word in Spanish and one of my friends will say, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean what you think it means, or that has a negative connotation, and I hadn't known. So even our students who have really high levels of English and have been using English for years might not know some of the connotations of these words. So in thesaurus.com, if you type in a word, like for example, I typed in the word big and you get synonyms, typically what happens at the top tab where it says in white, large, great, that's usually an equivalent synonym. That's usually something that has a very close meaning, like almost exactly the same meaning. And then the other words are words that might have very different shades. They might be negative, they might be positive, they might be neutral. They're not exact synonyms of that word that you typed in. And someone asked me why some of them are in orange and some are in light. Does anyone know? I'm assuming it means that the words in orange are probably more commonly used. So for example, looking at this list, your student might see the word humongous. They're writing an academic paper. They keep saying big, big, big. They want to use a different word, and they use the word humongous. And they might not know, what that means. They might not know if it's formal, informal, if it's positive, negative. So you could give students, a group of students, this list, for example, and ask them, please divide these words into words that are neutral, positive, negative. And again, of course, it really depends on the context. So you might give them a context and say, use these words to describe a crowd. Okay, so someone says it was, an enormous crowd or humongous crowd or a thundering crowd. How does that change the meaning of these words? Okay, let's see. Oh, okay, thank you. Someone said that orange ones are used more frequently. That makes sense. Another thing that you can do is, again, these are activities that could just take, 5 minutes or so in your class. You could use a corpus. Here I'm using the COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English, but just use a corpus, have them look up a certain word in a corpus, and you can have them see then, would this be a word that you could use in academic writing or not? Is it formal? Is it informal? And in COCA, when you type in the word humongous to search for it, on the left, you can see the context. So we see magazine, spoken, fiction, news, spoken, etc. So none of those contexts say academic. These aren't academic contexts. So the word humongous came up being used in all of these non-academic contexts. And even if we look at the news, which might think should be a little more formal or objective, it looks like one of the examples at least is from a quotation. So again, it's the equivalent of spoken or of speech, or that it's used within quotation marks to show that part is being quoted. So just for students to be aware that, okay, I can see from doing this quick corpus search that humongous isn't something I should be using in my academic paper. And you could also give students examples of things that you find online. This is actually an authentic text, I think maybe from an article in the New York Times, and ask students to rewrite this text in a more neutral way. So this example says that the Supreme Court has just flinched from its responsibility to stop the unjust jailing of 2 journalists, not charged with any wrongdoing, by a runaway prosecutor who will go to any lengths to use the government's contempt power to force them to betray their confidential sources. So what are some words that students might notice, or expressions that the students might notice as being quite strong language or showing some sort of bias or sounding quite subjective? What are some words that you notice that you might change, or some wording that you might rewrite to make this sound more neutral? Flinched, yeah, flinched is a strong word, right? Unjust, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Runaway, a runaway prosecutor, right? And contempt is a strong word, but contempt power is actually a thing. It's not. This isn't a descriptor here. It's a sort of power that the government has. Go to any lengths, yes. Betray, yes, great. And so here's an example. This is an example of one rewriting. And you could still say there are still some strong words here, still words that can convey some subjectivity. So the rewriting was the Supreme Court has just refused to exercise its power. Okay, so even that's quite strong. This is just refused to exercise its power to stop the jailing of 2 journalists, not charged with any wrongdoing, by an independent prosecutor. So that's much more neutral, right? Independent versus runaway. Runaway has this connotation of some rogue prosecutor who's doing something illegal, right? Who will use the government's contempt power aggressively. And aggressively is still a strong word, but it's much more neutral than go to any lengths. Go to any lengths sounds like, again, like they might do something illegal. Use the power aggressively to force them to reveal their confidential sources. So betray versus reveal. Betray has a much stronger connotation, almost like a sense of immorality, right? Versus revealing, which is more neutral. And then you could always ask your students, what is the opinion of the writer, right? So does the writer think that the Supreme Court should stop the jailing or not, right? So you would hope that students reading this would be able to see that the writer strongly disagrees with the Supreme Court's decision, right? And that's what we want students to be looking at. And someone mentioned this as journalese. Yes, definitely. That is journalese. Okay. And also wanting students to recognize that, right? Okay. So question. Okay. So my question for you is, what are some words that the instant that you hear someone's use the word or you see it in writing, you think, I know who that person voted for, or I can immediately guess what that person's political affiliation is, or what that person's religious belief, or I can guess something about this person's strong beliefs just by a word that they use. And you can use words in English or use words in a different language and just explain what they are, because this also is an activity I think that's good to do with students, asking them to do this in their first language, right? What are some words in your first language that when you hear, you think, oh, that person definitely voted for this person, or that person is probably a member of this religion or whatever. What kind of beliefs can you guess from the use of a term? Someone's talking about a true patriot, patriotic, and you'll have to translate some of the words that aren't English. Levak, feminist, standing for women's rights. Lefty, interesting. Okay, so a lot of post-communist words. My students in Poland said there's a word in Poland that is used to describe someone who's conservative, but it also means like can. So it's a word that if someone uses, people immediately know, oh, that person's not a conservative, that person's liberal. Opinionated, oh, that depends on the context too, right? But yeah, opinionated, there's often a meaning, a feeling behind that someone's disapproving of someone having opinions. Liberal and socialist are probably said more by conservatives. True, yeah. Debating an issue. Yeah. And what about lefty? A few of you said lefty. Is that something that you think would be said by someone on the right to describe someone on the left? White power. Interesting. Okay, thank you. So that's what that means. Okay. Leftist. Okay, so lefty can have some negative connotations. Right. Political leftist. Okay. So wait one more minute to hear a few more answers. Normal can have connotations, true. Right-winger equals fascist. Women empowerment, okay. Oh, a student said that I bring to class lefty text. Interesting. So you would assume that this student is possibly not on the left, right? They're complaining, okay. Jid, okay. Oh, interesting. So the word collaborate can have a negative connotation in Poland due to World War II. Interesting, right? The historical context means a lot, right? And Levick, is that the word that means lefty? Okay. Well, I think too that reminds us that, you know, that we all have a bias, and sometimes it's good to overtly let our students know. Like, I identify as liberal, and I let my students know that so that they understand what perspective that I'm coming from when I share certain opinions. Depending on the context, sometimes you might not feel comfortable sharing any of your opinions in class. Okay. So in Pakistan, collaborate is used in negative connotation to mean conniving with someone. Interesting. And that's great to know. The context is so important. Great. Okay, so I want to move on because we don't have much time left. So another thing that we want to help students with is when they're doing online research, okay? And so as we've just discussed, we are aware that certain words might signal a certain bias, but our students might not. So for example, when I teach immigrants in the United States, we've talked about people using the terms undocumented immigrant versus illegal or illegal immigrant. So for me, if I hear those different terms, I can immediately kind of assume what someone's opinion is on immigration. So it's helpful to make students aware of certain terms that they hear and what they might signify in terms of bias. So I'll talk a little bit about political language. I wanted to ask you, if you hear the words big government or the terms big government and bleeding heart in the context of the United States, who do you think would use those terms? So it would be someone who's more politically liberal or more politically conservative? Yeah, so, and some of you said big government and bleeding heart or conservative. So I see that we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. So yes, in the United States, at least, a big government is a term that is used by conservatives to describe that they think government has too much overreach. Government is doing too much. Bleeding heart would be a term used by conservatives to describe a liberal who, you cry about everything. You care too much about everyone, or you want to spend money on everyone, okay, to paraphrase. And then also these two expressions, flyover states and people experiencing homelessness. Who do you think might use those terms? Someone who's more conservative or someone who's more liberal, if you've heard these terms before? And it's not always cut and dry. Yeah, so someone said liberal. So flyover states is sometimes used by liberals who live on the coast, who live in the big cities on the coast, and it's used to describe the states in the middle of the country that typically that are viewed as conservative. And it's a derogatory term, and not everyone uses it. It doesn't necessarily mean someone's liberal, but it's kind of used to dismiss some states in the center of the country. And people experiencing homelessness is something that I think that people say, rather than, someone who's liberal would say, rather than viewing homeless as like a permanent category. So maybe some people who don't have as much compassion for people who are experiencing homelessness view homeless as like a kind of person. Whereas, you know, in the States, we have students that are college students that are living in their cars. So homelessness can sometimes be a temporary situation. It's not necessarily a permanent state, right? Okay, so here's another resource I found, and it's from the website Information is Beautiful. If you're into like infographics, which I love infographics, this site has absolutely beautiful infographics. And this is something when your students are doing research, if they're doing research relating to, I'm giving examples from the United States, but if you know they're going to be reading news sources from a certain country or articles from a certain country, you want them to be aware of the biases in that country. So this infographic says some things, some general beliefs that people on the left have, some general beliefs that people on the right have. So, you know, different views of parenting, different views about government. Should government interfere in certain issues? Should government not interfere? And this, it's kind of hard to see the whole graphic on this in this webinar, but I recommend you go to Information is Beautiful to check out this visualization. And it's called Left versus Right World, if you want to look that up. And also, on a related note, this graphic was put together by All Sides. And All Sides is a site that says no one has no bias. Everyone has bias, but the point is to be aware of it. So if you have students going to different news sites, you would like them to you'd like them to have an awareness of, oh, the Nation, for example, said this, but the Washington Times is saying this. And you want students to be aware, well, the Nation is known to be a more left-leaning publication, and the Washington Times is a little more conservative. So again, it doesn't mean that people will lose their biases, but more that it's good to be aware of the bias of the resources that you are accessing. Okay. And here are a few more resources if any of you are interested. Someone did mention that they've done the MOOC. So this is a free online course, English for Media Literacy, through the University of Pennsylvania and the State Department. And I've heard really great things about this course. And if you go to Penn America, they have a new Consumers Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. If you have higher level students, they can review this idea of rights that consumers should have when we're reading media, that we should be able to assume that journalists are telling the truth, or that we're notified of a conflict of interest. If a certain CEO owns a certain media outlet, we should be aware of that because the news will be biased towards that corporation. Another one, Teaching Tolerance, has videos about fake news and talks about how something can go from someone's social media post to suddenly being disseminated as actual news. It's really interesting. Commonsense.org has a lot of lesson plans and information if you're teaching upper grades like secondary about newspaper bias. Google has a Be Internet Awesome curriculum that you can use with your students to help them with digital citizenship. And here are some more resources on Newseum Ed, Brain Pop. Media Smarts is a Canadian website which has a lot of concepts about teaching about media. Read, Write, Think, and Media Literacy Now. So these are some sites that have some great resources for teachers so that you're not having to create all of your materials from scratch. And if you'd like more information about exchange programs, I was an English language fellow through an exchange program, and there are exchange programs for US citizens and for people who aren't US citizens. So it's not just for Americans. And if you want to follow the EL program site on Instagram, and I have a page, IATEFL Poland, on Instagram. I haven't been using Facebook much, but I post on Instagram. I've been posting resources related to Black Lives Matter, resources related to, reading recommendations, things about like learning languages, etc. Okay, so I don't know how much time we have left. I'll have to ask Lucina or Martin, but if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box, and I hope I have a few minutes left to respond to them. You're welcome.
I've got a question that bugs me it has been bugging me for a long time. When I do such topics in a public school, or if I prepare my students for public speaking, I very often get the comments from parents or from my fellow teachers that this is the double-edged sword. Namely, this way you may actually teach young adults to manipulate and to be more persuasive, not for a good cause. What would you say to that?
I would say that you can use any knowledge for good or bad, but that I think that developing that awareness is really important. I mean, if there's a student that's trying to manipulate people, they probably would have done it with or without the lesson, right? But I think that's really important to teach it anyway. And actually a comment or concern I've heard from people is, well, if we're teaching students to be aware of bias and to question authority, aren't they going to question us as teachers? Aren't they going to be more difficult in the classroom? I mean, my view is that good. But practically speaking, we can't always let every single student in the class question every single activity or every single decision we make. But I think if you communicate with students that there's an outlet, a place for them to come to you if they have a question, they can email you, come to office hours, or talk to you if they disagree with something or have a question. I think it's only good that we're encouraging students to think for themselves, even if that means they don't agree with us. Like some of the commenters said, the student accused them of being a lefty. I've definitely had students who've disagreed with things I've said in class, and that that's fine. We don't want our students to agree with everything that we say. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I usually respond to people asking such question. One more bugs me. When would you be willing to start media literacy? At what level of a system of education?
I'm going to have to defer that question to people who've taught elementary, because I know we can do it in secondary and obviously in university adult ed, but I'm wondering for the primary teachers who are on this chat, at what age do you start doing media literacy, or what age do you think would be possible with your students? Because I'm sure we have a few primary teachers here. Oh, and someone asked if it's possible to get the slides. And yes, just if you email me at this email address, willowbarnosky.elfellow@gmail.com, I can send you the PowerPoint.
Would you like us to send it with a certificate, or rather not?
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
okay.
That's fine. So someone asked about the safest age. Yeah. So do any primary teachers that have taught media literacy? Because I teach mostly university and adults. So someone said even at 8 years old, because they're exposed to media and hear things that frighten them. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think some social media has a minimum age. Like I think Facebook says 13, but we know children are viewing media much younger than that. Middle school, someone said, the sooner the better. Yeah, and that might be a case too, where teachers are, when you know your students and you know who you're working with, you're aware, are my students at the age that they're sending text messages? Are they at the age that they're on Facebook or Instagram? Are they at the age where they are exposed to social media, or are they watching the news with their parents? And so you know what your students are exposed to, and you know at what age you could probably start having those conversations. 7 to 8 years old. Okay, great. Okay, so were there any other questions that I missed?
That seems to be okay. On Facebook, we had some quite a big crowd, but they usually commented on the go, so there's no need to kind of ask any other further questions.
Okay. And I hope that everyone's seen some of the comments, people sharing resources like First News, VOA, things like that. And I think that's fantastic. And I hope people will continue to share resources maybe on the Facebook comments. But I thank you so much for all of you who have come and shared your ideas and your thoughts. It's wonderful to be able to talk with people from all around the world. And I really appreciate your taking your time to learn more about this topic.
Well, thank you very much, Willow. It's been great pleasure to meet you once again. And this time online, we are looking forward to cooperating with us, and we are looking forward to next webinars from the scope of global issues, media literacy. This is absolutely needed, well, that would be fantastic if we could just ask you to present something sometimes in the future.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay. I'm a big fan of IATEFL Poland.
Thank you very much. We are great fans of you. Well, guys, we are so proud that we had so many participants here on Facebook. You can obtain the certificate and Willow's presentation on our web page. You will be directed to this web page after the webinar has finished, and there will be the web page with information on this webinar and also with two buttons. One button with the certificate and second button to click with the presentation. Okay.
Perfect. Great. And everybody stay safe and healthy. Take care.
Thank you very much, and all the best to you. Thanks, Willow. Thanks, Lucinda, and thanks all to all of you. Bye-bye.